Welcome back to the London Futurists podcast. I'm Callum Chase, a co-founder of the AI safety startup Contium and a writer and keynote speaker on the future of AI.
And I'm David Wood, a survivor from the early days of the smartphone industry who aspires nowadays to be a radical real-world futurist.
David and I are continuing our investigation into the implications of the economic singularity, the time when we need a new economic system because full automation by AI means that people can no longer obtain the resources they need by doing jobs. Our guest today is Ewan McMillan, the founder of New Gradient, an Edinburgh-based consultancy that builds AI systems for a variety of industries from biotech to mining. He took a degree in theoretical physics at the University of Edinburgh, and since then he spent 7 years delivering applied AI R&D. We wanted to have Ewan on the show because he also writes about the economics of AI from the perspective of somebody who is actually implementing it. This spring, he posted a series of thought-provoking articles called The Economics of AGI. So Ewan, welcome to the London Futurist podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for joining us, Ewan.
So Ewan, let's start with your journey into and through AI. How did a degree in theoretical physics translate into a career in AI? And what exactly does New Gradient do?
Certainly not directly translate. When I studied theoretical physics, at least, there was maybe one optional course which touched on machine learning, which I actually didn't end up taking. So it wasn't necessarily that the contents were translating in any way, but I had quite a lot of tangential interest, should we say, to the actual core studies. I would often be reading philosophy and economics and whatnot on the side. And towards the middle of my degree, that got me caught up in machine learning and artificial intelligence. Back then, I was really struck not necessarily by the capability of what was available in 2018-19 era, but more how little it was being used. Even back then, you had a lot of data science techniques and machine learning techniques that were really not heavily applied across industries. So that initially, the gap between capability and use case was what caught my attention. How I translated physics into that was to spend a lot of my own time researching this stuff, playing around with it. You tend to find physicists at the frontier of many fast-moving fields, whether that's biology or chemistry. The hard problems, physicists tend to be drawn to them. And that's certainly been the case with AI. You have a lot of the top labs which are founded or at least heavily going after employing physicists. In terms of what ourselves as New Gradient, what we actually do, we're much more technical than most AI consultancies. We believe in heavily specializing systems for use cases. Our thesis is really that markets get filled by companies who specialize, and we think AI will have to do the same thing. There's a lot of AI consultancies applying general LLMs to peripheral tasks. But our thesis is that the niche that the company actually fills will have to have AI specialized to that niche. When we come in and ask a business, what do you do? People rarely answer, we do spreadsheets and email. They say the thing they actually do. And we believe that there'll be specialized systems that we can build for that actual task. And those specialized systems outperform and are often cheaper than general purpose systems.
And do you apply this belief in specialization to your own firm? Because you operate in all sorts of different sectors. So what is your speciality?
Yeah, that is often the quib that gets thrown back at me, actually. We're remarkably generalist for how much we believe in specialization. I would say the thing that we specialize in is the insight on knowing what goes where. The insight layer of having an understanding of all of the possible techniques and applications that you can use AI for, an understanding of the general landscape of the technology, the specifics of each of the parts of the landscape, and then being able to apply that to each different problem.
I can see that specialization has an important role in the short term. It's clearly the case that you can often craft a solution for a particular domain by having deep knowledge of that domain. But what do you think about the thesis known as bitter lesson by Rich Sutton, who argues that sooner or later, general AIs, general algorithms will be a better bet for all particular tasks? He points to, for example, chess computers. Once upon a time, to be a really good chess computer, you needed huge amounts of chess knowledge. More recently, a general reinforcement learning system was able to outperform all these specialist chess computers. Do you have a view on that?
I think the argument for the bitter lesson is more on a general purpose learning algorithm than a single general purpose system. It's an argument that a system that doesn't require very much handcrafting will be better. But I don't think even if you could create such a system that didn't require handcrafting to learn from a set of data, so say you had input X and output Y, and I was to always apply this same general purpose algorithm to different sets of input X and output Ys, a small specialized model that had, let's say, only learned on a subset of data inherently only has to learn a smaller distribution. So you could have a smaller model just doing that. You could be the same general purpose algorithm that you'd apply to build your model, but you could still have a smaller, more efficient model than take a model that has to fit all data, similar to what we have now with LLMs, but a model that has to learn everything. It inherently has to carry around that baggage, even when it only wants to do a small task on repeat. The perfect analogy right now is you wouldn't want to use Claude Fable to summarize your documents because there's lots of extra baggage there in its generalization that you could have smaller models that are just specialized to do smaller tasks.
Your articles about the economics of AI show that you've also developed a strong grasp of economics. Did you manage to do that while you were not being entirely preoccupied by theoretical physics, which sounds quite an achievement? Or have you studied it since?
I'm not an economist, so I should be careful there. My understanding of economics, I guess, comes from practicing the day job. We've been a service firm for 7 years, and we've done a lot of internal research about where different industries are going to be affected, where different technologies are going to commoditize certain tasks within industries, where you might have data moats, where certain competition dynamics might result in commoditization or loss of margin. And this is really all to try and inform when we're going into a firm and recommending where they should apply AI. We don't want to say, okay, well, you should apply this general system if we know that this is what all their other competitors are just going to apply, and it's going to result in everyone's profit margins just being driven down, and there's really no net effect, no net benefit to them. So really a lot of the understanding that I've built up is built up from analyzing how we think AI will affect specific firms and industries, and then extrapolating that back up to a more macro level. When you look at a single firm and say, in the limit, let's imagine you could replace every task with a frontier LLM. What does your company become? It becomes a shell for frontier LLMs. So have you just abstracted the entire value away from your company? Now, this is one specific case, of course. There's many other cases of how you could apply AI. But that trend from one single firm to the whole economy is clear to see that that would result in massive flows of value towards frontier AI labs. These kind of trends from single firms to the economy as a whole is a personal interest leap from the area that I would say I'm more expertise at, which would be understanding this within a specific company or industry.
So we could consider two different firms, each of whom is under pressure to use platform LLMs from frontier AI models. And one of them says, well, I'm going to hold off this. I want to maintain my competitive advantage. I want to retain my domain expertise. And the other one says, well, it's not very nice, but we're going to end up with lower costs and more reliable service this way. And maybe that one thrives for a bit, but over time, more and more of the companies end up as smaller and smaller shells. And the ones who try to fight against it will lose their competitive stake in the market. What's going to prevent the gradual hollowing out of the whole economy and the accumulation of value in one or two mega frontier AI companies?
Yeah, so there's absolutely that fear. There's a few things that I think could result in what I would call some pooling of value at the firm level or the traditional company level. Firstly is specialization. So if we were to look at the long tail of things, let's say there's a task or a process within my business that happens, and I could replace that with a frontier LLM, or I could try and build a specialized system. It might turn out that because the frontier LLM isn't built for it, and the frontier LLM, as I referred to earlier, has to carry this general baggage around of being good at everything, it might cost $100 to complete that task. But I might be able to build a specialized system which can do that for $6. So I've potentially just made massive headroom there. If everyone else goes and replaces task A with something that costs $100 and I've done it for $6, I've got $94 to actually take some margin there. This can result in some pooling at the company if I decide to specialize. The second thing is more abstract. The automation picture assumes quite a static picture. Firms will do in the future as they have done now. It's the same task. It's just we're replacing the building blocks from humans to AI. But of course, the economy is more dynamic than that. The things that firms do, the niches they fill, they adapt and they change, and people find more efficient ways to do things. I write about this concept called stochastic insight generation, which is where you might find frequently that you can surface areas of inefficiency or better ways of doing things. And maybe LLMs deployed across your business even surface these insights themselves. This might be an insight where you realize that actually I can cut out task B entirely, let's say. And so now I've saved myself $100. This might be an insight that has been generated by an LLM, and it might be something that your competitor will stumble on eventually, but you still get to gain the advantage of that insight being generated for some set period of time until your competitor discovers it. So if I eliminate task B and it costs $100, and I'm the only one who has realized that for a month, then I've gained the $100 every time I repeated that task for that month. And then when my competitor comes along, maybe that margin that I was gaining will be competed away, but that's okay. By then, maybe I have surfaced another insight and I can remove the costs associated with that. And slowly, we're always generating places where value is kept at the individual company level.
Let's dive into a couple of those things. Firstly, the specialization, the idea that a cheaper model can be more efficient and so economically successful. But firstly, cheaper models could come from the frontier labs. Secondly, they could very likely come from companies which are applying their models across an industry. There are benefits of scale as well as from specialization. So a company which creates brilliant, cheap models for the oil industry is quite likely to be producing a better and more useful model than, say, Shell or BP generating their own specialist model, which means that Shell and BP are going to struggle to generate survivable returns. Is that right or not?
We have to look at where the data lives within the industries that exist. Labs do generate smaller models. They're always distilling their models. There's a lot of work that goes into making general purpose language models distilled and smaller. I still think the argument holds that if you take a language model and you specialize it to a particular domain, say I could take a very small language model and specialize it to summarize a particular type of document. And on repeat, if I'd specialized it to that task, it would still probably be cheaper than the equivalent performance general model that could do it out of the box. I think labs are unlikely to specialize to task. That is probably left to the firm to do the specialization to task. So you're still likely to get some marginal benefit from specialization to task if that's a repeated task. Then in terms of one company applying across industry, it's certainly possible. However, if you looked at where the data lived from Shell or BP, the data probably exists within Shell and BP. If you're a company that can get all the data from Shell and all the data from BP, perhaps you can make a model that does many of the tasks that Shell and BP do, and you could sell it back to them and you'd be massively profitable. Now, if you're Shell and BP, you have to be thinking, okay, well, perhaps I don't want to open field day on my data and I should build something internally. Of course, there is a competition dynamic here that maybe the first to sell makes a lot of benefit. They sell all their data to a lab and the lab can incorporate that capability into a general purpose model. They will have done themselves out of future business and they've certainly done their competitors out of business. But if individual firms decide to keep hold of their data, which there's certainly like a protection dynamic, which would say that that would be favored, I think that there's an argument for why they would build specialized models themselves.
Let me try another example of the difference between general purpose systems and specialized systems. This is from my own background. I spent a long time in the early days of the mobile phone and smartphone business. And in around 1998, we were very sure that a specialized smartphone operating system would outcompete any of the general purpose operating systems that were somehow squashed into the smartphone, such as Microsoft Windows. People kept talking about a Linux operating system that might eventually become useful for smartphones. And there was this weird thing called Apple OS. And for 10 years, we were right. None of these systems were able to be well suited to the particular demands of high performance, low hardware smartphones. But by about 2008, we had lost that battle. Linux had been modified. The hardware itself got more capable. And companies such as my own, Symbian, and some of our original competitors like Palm OS or BlackBerry, who'd all developed specialized solutions suited to mobile communicators, we were all pushed aside by monoliths who were able to adapt their general purpose solutions from elsewhere into our space. So there was a while in which we flourished, but over time there was less. And I fear that it's going to be the same with the big tech companies who are not just going to be producing operating systems, of course, or models, large language models. They're going to be producing lots of add-ons too. Whether it's Anthropic or OpenAI or Google, they are working in their own specific domains too. Solutions for enterprise, solutions for healthcare. So I think you've got your work cut out, although I wish you the best of success. How do you respond to that analogy?
That's an interesting point. It's impossible to say exactly what will be eaten up by the general frontier and what will remain niche and specialized. There are areas of our economy where some small specialized system could prevail. And there are areas where it's just more efficient because of all the development that was, let's say, going into Linux anyway at the time. If you could piggyback on all the progress that was made in Linux and you could apply that to smartphone, that dynamic outcompeted the aspect that a specialized system might be better. Say there's some dynamic in which specialization is better because it maybe allows you to be smaller and more efficient. But then there's the competing dynamic, which is you can piggyback on all this development that's happening in the Linux environment because it's more general. So there are absolutely nuances to that story. I don't think it's a specialization always wins or a generalization always wins. And you have to look at, are you sufficiently ring-fenced in a specialized environment? Is there a sufficient lack of incentive at times for a general system to get into that specific environment? And a lot of the times that's looking at the cost benefit that can be had by specializing. Often if it's talking about task automation, you can look at it. Is it a repetitive task? Would I want to pay the cost of having a general system for something repetitive? In the smartphone world, the compute improvements probably just meant that you didn't need specialized operating systems because eventually the extra overhead of having a general Linux system on there didn't matter because it was cheap enough to just buy a few extra compute cores or a faster processor than it was to maintain this software base. So there's always going to be competing dynamics. And I think it is situationally specific, basically, which is a really unsatisfying answer. But that's the way the economy has always worked, I suppose.
Economics is full of very unsatisfactory answers. I think you're making a reasonable case that the frontier labs won't, at least in the medium term, hoover up entire economies because smaller firms can retain some foothold, partly because of their data, perhaps partly because of their specialization. They've got industry knowledge and that's valuable and hard to transfer. But I'm not sure that you're making a case for humans still having jobs. If the economic value is being created by AIs, which are owned by, let's say, 5,000 firms globally instead of 3,000 firms, that's nice, but it doesn't really help the 8 billion humans, or whatever it is, 4 billion of us who need to have jobs. If AIs are doing all the work that humans used to do, or doing all the jobs that humans used to do.
You're absolutely right. Sadly, I don't claim to be making an argument that humans will still be significant participators. I think it's still a preferable world if the value is spread over, say, 10,000 companies rather than 3. I think there are ways in which we could have the value of those 10,000 companies more evenly distributed among the 8 billion humans, where it's unlikely to see how, if value filtered to 3 companies, that could be distributed well.
Actually, you could argue the opposite. You could say if you've got 3 companies which have just acquired the entire world economy, then addressing those 3 companies and say, oi, you are going to share this with the 8 billion others of us, might be quite a bit easier than having that conversation with 10,000 companies in all sorts of different countries.
It might be an easier initial conversation, but I think people have very little leverage on that conversation. Because those companies are likely to be controlled by very few people, and no one else has power in that situation. No one else has any sway or any leverage on those 3 people because they don't require anyone else for their economy to work. Whereas if I have 5,000, 50,000 companies, 10,000 companies that all have sort of a say in the economy, they all somewhat rely on the others chipping in for the economy to work.
Let's just challenge that for a moment. Let's say you get the 3 companies who own the entire world economy. They kind of do depend on other people participating because if they don't have any customers, if all their customers are dying, starving to death, then they've lost their market. And these people, we know who we're talking about. We're talking about Sam Altman and Elon Musk and Dario Amodei and so on. And they've all read E&M Banks. They are science fiction fans and they believe in the culture of abundance and a post-abundance economy. This is what David and I spend our time struggling with. how can we make that economy work? I'm not sure that dealing with three companies is necessarily going to be harder than dealing with 10,000. If the three decided, oh, actually, we want to go and live on a remote Pacific island, magnificently defended by weapons of astonishing defensive capability, and we'll just wait until the rest of you all starve to death. We'll save a few thousand of our mates, and then we'll start civilization again with that and go back and live in San Francisco when it's all over. That would be a very, very grim outcome, and it's not entirely impossible. But I don't really think that's what they want to do.
I see your point. Your point is that the consumer at the end of the day has some power. Fundamentally, even if they've hollowed out every other business in the world, those businesses were still selling something to the consumers. The value that they've captured was derived from the consumer. But they still have ultimate control of how much the consumer gets in that scenario.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. The consumer doesn't have any power. It's just if they're removed from the equation, then the structure doesn't work. It has to change dramatically.
Agreed. The structure has to change, but ultimately that consumer, their buying power is entirely dictated by those three people. Whereas in a distributed world, the buying power of the consumer is not necessarily dictated by three people. You still have many more incentives or many more players all fighting for their own incentives, which one would hope or one would think would lead to a slightly more balanced world.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the stochastic insight generation, because that seems an unusual and interesting idea. There's the idea that as an AI is working with you and members of your company, it will notice things that maybe you humans hadn't noticed, and it will be able to say, hey, why don't you sack this person over here and give their jobs like this and to speed up this process? Or do you have other things in mind? New product possibilities, for example?
The first thing I was thinking about when this came to mind was the process of innovation in a post-AGI world. There's this concept in economics, Howard equilibrium, where basically you need the right amount of protection to make markets flourish and to make innovation flourish. Too much protection and you'll end up in the monopolies, not enough protection, and you'll never have an incentive to create. You'll never be able to exercise the gains that you innovated. Say you're a drug company and you create a drug. If there's no patents on your drug, then someone will just copy it and the work you put into creating the drug is useless. You can't make any profit on it. Whereas if you're a drug company and your patent lasts forever, there's also no incentive to innovate because you have like a monopoly. And then in software, we never quite had it like that. In software, the thing that allowed execution of the innovation was the time it took a competitor to replicate your innovation. So let's say I was Apple and I created an operating system. It's not a trivial task to recreate an operating system. And by the time someone else had created an operating system, Apple was already somewhat embedded. And so there's leaving costs associated with customers and whatnot. So they have time to build this moat and they execute on their innovation. In the future, where AI allows execution sort of instantaneously, there's very little argument to be made that you can incentivize genuine innovation for new companies, let's say. This is where I strongly disagree with Sam Altman, Dario Amodei, where they think they're going to have a solo billionaire unicorn founder, because the implication of a unicorn billionaire founder, a single person company, is that the AI has done all the execution. Well, if the AI has done all the execution, presumably someone can just copy it also with instant execution. And your $1 billion is really heavily competed away. So you have this concept where innovation is not really heavily incentivized in a post-AGI world, but still within companies, you can have this kind of rapid innovation where you don't need to build moats on the innovations that you make. When you're a startup, you need to become load-bearing on your innovation before someone copies you for there actually to be like a switching cost associated with them leaving you. Whereas if you're already a company, you're already load-bearing. So when you create a new innovation, you can capitalize on that innovation and capture temporary gains from that innovation before one of your competitors copies you. They might copy you quite quickly. And in a post-AGI world, we might expect that copying rate to continually increase. But we might expect that also with increased intelligence, these innovations get generated faster and faster. So you kind of end up in this place where almost innovation insights within businesses, this stochastic insight generation. And when I talk about an insight, I really mean insight innovation. They're somewhat interchangeable. An insight is really just an idea of where we can better assign resource So you have these insights being generated very quickly, you have them being competed away quickly, and it's almost like approximating a sort of stock market type scenario where people generate insights into what's misvalued in a stock market. But because the stock market's now highly efficient, has many players, those insights into what's misvalued get priced in really quickly. But there's a small period of time where you can make some alpha on that. You could imagine a world where intelligence was completely ubiquitous, where these really rapid insights get generated and then competed away really quickly, and you capture temporary gains. It's all fine for established companies, but it's very, very difficult for startups to break it.
So I'm hearing about accelerating pace and the need for companies, therefore, to be more nimble and quicker in understanding things and putting their ideas into practice.
Yes.
One of the sections of your article that really resonated with me was where you say, what isn't an open question is that almost nobody seems to be seriously thinking about it. You write about a meeting with a group of very smart people who were discussing the impact of AI on the economy. And you say not a single one of them was thinking about what happens in the limit. What does a consumer economy look like when a significant chunk of consumer income has been absorbed by 5 or 6 technology companies? That is what this series of podcasts is all about. So how do we get people to start thinking seriously about this? I used to think that self-driving cars would be the technology that would wake everybody up. They'd see a self-driving car and they'd think, goodness, we don't allow humans to do that until they're adults, and now robots are doing it. These things are getting really smart. Well, it turns out that didn't happen. I mean, we haven't got self-driving cars everywhere, but they're quite common in American cities and Chinese cities. And still, most people are not thinking seriously about full automation. They're not thinking seriously about superintelligence. And then I thought when GPT-3 came along, or 3.5, I thought, wow, this is really impressive and it's going to wake everybody up. And it hasn't. And we now have machines which can write a McKinsey report in 3 seconds. And people are still not thinking seriously about full automation or superintelligence. What will it take to wake up, A, all of humans, and B, just enough economists and politicians so that it becomes a live debate and becomes the number one topic of conversation in any media report, in any election, as opposed to an afterthought in everybody's lives?
What you're saying is that people should have been woken up by the thing that comes first, which is the technological capability. And we should have been able to extrapolate and say, okay, well, this technological capability clearly has quite a lot of impact or will have a lot of impact on our society. But that extrapolation process clearly hasn't happened. And so what we're seeing is the worst case scenario where actually what it's going to take to wake people up is the impact to land. So it's not the thing that will cause the impact, it's the impact. And that's a really concerning scenario because as we're seeing, there's a huge overhang between capability and impact. And that's only getting worse every day. The labs, as we can see, are improving on the models far faster than that improvement is making its way into impact. The impact's broad in this definition. Impact is impact within firms. So the automation capability of all these models, and therefore the subsequent economic impacts, its job displacement, its consumer buying power. That is what I mean by impact. Currently, we're accelerating the technological capability exponentially, but we're much slower at seeing the impact just because we're not good at propagating this stuff through our current society. When that impact does hit, the technology we have, when that impact hits enough for people to wake up, the consequences of the technology we will have developed still won't have been felt yet. There'll be this capability gap that still exists. So the impact that will happen will be so much worse. And it will already be true that the technology exists to make that impact so much worse that even if we stop when the impact is bad, the impact is going to get really bad because that technology already exists. That is as far as I see the dynamic that is playing out. And I think is a really bad dynamic. And we need people to start running that extrapolation process rather than waiting for the impact to act.
I think there's a very good distinction to make between the technology and its impact. But the people who really, really ought to be able to see the technology and understand there'll be an impact is economists and policymakers. And yet they don't. There was an open letter signed by Stiglitz and Krugman recently, which had the rather barefaced cheek to blame politicians for not paying attention when they have been studiously avoiding paying attention for decades. So maybe they are starting to wake up, but it's a slow old process. And if they leave it much longer, it'll be too late. Because I think the impact is likely to be quite explosive. I think what we have now are hobbled superintelligences. Claude is already superintelligent in so many ways, but it's hobbled because it hasn't really got a broad spectrum common sense. It hasn't really got a good world model to go alongside its language model. those deficiencies will be closed. And when they are closed, I don't think that the deployment gap is going to be as long as people think it will be. The day that it is possible to do lawyering with Claude rather than Claude plus a decent lawyer, that day, I imagine human lawyers are going to disappear. It could be very, very sudden, and that could apply across the whole of white-collar work.
I would argue that maybe it's not as sudden, but that because the deployment gap exists, the impact eventually will be larger. My argument being that because deployment lags capability, we have more time to keep on increasing capability before we feel the impacts on deployment. It's hard to say, but there's a whole bunch of messy things that could slow down deployment. Lobbying even from individuals. At the end of the day, there's humans in the loop somewhere and they slow it down. And I think that's roughly what we're seeing. Enterprises are being kind of slow at adopting this stuff because some of them still don't even have a data policy on what they can send to third-party LLM providers. So these things will slow it down, I think, a bit, but I think that's actually, in the long run, worse. Maybe it doesn't snap like that, but I think the ultimate end of where that gets to is probably worse.
So my final question would be, in case John Healey, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, or even Andy Burnham, the new Prime Minister, in case they said they don't have time to read all your articles, but they hear you've got some good advice, what would you ask the UK politicians to do?
Oh, goodness me.
Oh, obviously listen to this podcast.
Indeed, yeah. I really shouldn't be the person advising on it, but that's probably how we all feel. There should be people up there really thinking deeply about it. If I could encourage one thing, I guess is the one thing that I probably argued. I have some hope that we'll end up in some world where value pools at the multiple thousands of companies level. So I would argue for distributed ownership of companies sooner. I think that regardless of how many participators in the economy we have, the world we're moving to is certainly one where wealth, not work, is the currency of the future. Owning things rather than selling your time for money is the currency of the future. We currently have an economy where the wealth is owned by far too few. So wealth distribution, whether that be in companies that people work for, we could have tax incentives to distribute the ownership of anyone's company. If I work for Tesco or if I work for BP or anyone, we could have incentives which allow distributed ownership of those companies to the employees. And then when the employees maybe inevitably get laid off, at least they own something in the asset that continues to generate value.
I'm sorry, but I'm going to really push hard back on that. We saw this tried when the Berlin Wall came down and the economies, particularly of Russia, but also Czechoslovakia as it then was, and other countries, they said, right, let's hand out shares in state-owned firms to everybody. And what happened immediately was 99% of the people said, well, what on earth do I do with this share? I know, I'll give it to this bloke who's offering to buy me a potato with it. And within a year, you had almost all of the economies of those countries owned by a small number of oligarchs. That's where everything went terribly, terribly wrong in Russia. But it happened in the Czech Republic as well. Most people are not terribly good at hanging on to wealth, and they will trade it. They will sell it for something current, and they'll lose it. You've got to give them a continuous flow. You've got to give us all a continuous flow of income. We've got to have income coming from somewhere, and not from some modest bit of wealth that has been carved out of the global economy and given us to on a one-off basis. It will not work.
Well, perhaps we don't allow them to sell it.
If you can't sell it, it probably doesn't have much value.
Well, you could have value if anyone generates dividends from a small slice of the pie that you own.
Yeah.
Perhaps we'll all be listening to our wise, intelligent financial advisors who are giving us good, comprehensible, understandable, personalized advice as to hold on to this ownership.
If we are all forced to accept a gift of a little bit of the world economy, we get given a bit of the world economy and told you have to hold on to it and you can make your living off the dividends it pays, why not just have the state retain the assets and pay people the dividends? That will manage it much better, I suggest. Because saying to people, you've got a share in Tesco and they've got a share in Sainsbury's, when Tesco does much better than Sainsbury's, the people who got given a bit of Sainsbury's are going to be really pissed off. Whereas if the whole thing is pooled at the state level, the state can give you some income and will probably manage it a lot better. I think the idea of giving people little shares of the world economy is not going to work.
I think that's probably fair. Let's say pull it at the state level is probably a fair assumption. I think the trap that most people fall into when thinking to pool it at the state level is they sort of assume there should be a taxation issue. But then I think you end up in like a prisoner's dilemma where some other country just doesn't implement that tax.
Yeah.
And so the tax pooling system, I don't think works, but maybe the wealth pooling system works.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the other thing I heard from you is not just distributed ownership of companies or distributed ownership of some of the benefits in the companies, but you think it would be good for the economy probably if there's a distribution of companies. It's not just a small number of companies interacting. And perhaps economists should be exploring that model. What would be the advantages if there are 10,000 companies rather than just 3? And what measures might be put in place without constraining things arbitrarily that could support such a wide spread of companies for the foreseeable future rather than just for a few months or years?
Yeah, as we discussed a little earlier on, my perceived benefits of having more companies is you have more players with different incentives. And so maybe you end up in a world that's less easily controllable than if you just have 3 incentives being balanced. I think there's an argument of why it's a beneficial world. As to how to improve our chances of getting to a world where we have this, I think there's arguments for why the dynamics play out that way, as I've stated. I think there's arguments for why specialization is better in certain scenarios. I think there's arguments for how insight discovery ends up pooling value at the company level. I think there are arguments for why this happens. I'm not sure how to incentivize it happening.
Well, look, we don't have to come up with all the answers right now, fortunately. The main job is to get more and more people thinking about it and talking about it. And you've contributed really well to that. So thank you for that. And thank you for joining us on the London Futurist podcast.
Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for having me.
It's been a pleasure having you.